Hello and welcome to Arvos of Harvo for October. There's only two more of these for the rest of the year. I can't believe it's almost been 2 years of making these strange book review videos. Anyways, I am back from New York, it is business as usual, and let's look at these books. I am going on this side. So what I learned in New York is that giant first editions only really a thing here. So first editions in New York are a normal sized book, like this big, in fact even a little bit smaller. So I don't know why Australian first editions are so big, but yeah, that's what we're going through. Book number 1 of October, this is my aesthetic cover. This is Colson Whitehead's Harlem Shuffle. How great does this look? I really love the just basic colors in the front and this old-timey newspaper kind of style. It's a sort of like a crime fiction novel set in Harlem in the 1950s. I've never read any Colson Whitehead before. I know this isn't his most known or most respected work. I've got The Underground Railroad on my shelf, but I do want to read his newest book later this year, which is Crook Manifesto, and that is a direct sequel to this, so I read this first. This stars Ray Carney, who's a furniture salesman up in Harlem, and he is the son of this infamous thief and miscreant, but he's trying to do things the right way. But his cousin, Freddie, is tied up with some various forms of crime, and it brings Ray into this as well. And the structure of this is so familiar to me. It's this 3-episode, 3-heist structure, where our protagonist finds himself in a different conflict each time. It resolves itself into a nice package towards the end of each one. And it's more about exploring the place, and exploring the setting, the time period, but really with this tried and true classic crime fiction structure that's so familiar if you're someone who enjoys pulpy novels, crime fiction novels, but it does have that little literary edge as well. It's really trying to be true and accurate to this time period, and in some ways that makes it quite hard to read, because even having been, well, not been to Harlem, but been to New York, and knowing what the culture is like there, and knowing what the feeling of being in the city is like, I think this book really needs you to be immersed in that time period and that feeling. That's the intention of it. I think it comes across quite well. I think the crime fiction angle is also quite enjoyable. There is great interplay between morality and just the desire for greatness or desire for wealth and satisfaction that's so difficult to attain in America. And despite that these stories are really set in the 1950s, some of the questions about social class and race are still so relevant today. This is a really recent book, so the author's done a really great job of connecting the history to what is relevant to us today. The characters are all very likable. The pacing is a little bit on the slower side because I think it's leaning more towards literary than towards the crime, but I did enjoy myself the whole way through. I would give it a 4 out of 5. Book number 2, my slowpoke for October. This is Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. I've never read this before. I've heard quite good things about it because out of all the old classics, this is one that people tend to regard highly, but also speak about in quite positive terms. It's not a book that's divisive like Catcher in the Rye. It's not a book that feels like required university reading like Jane Austen. It's just a nice book, and I would agree. It's a book about 4 sisters growing up in the northeastern part of the United States in the 1800s, and it's quite personal to the life of its author, Louisa May Alcott. She's writing from personal experience growing up as a young woman in this time period, and the characters just feel very human, very much like they're your friends or people that you know, and it's so wonderful to go through life with them. It's not really a book with strong character arcs. Instead, it just has things happening to these 4 women, and you just follow it. You follow along. There's dramas, and there's ordinary days, there's romances, there's developments in everyone's lives. I'm reading the American edition, so this one has both, it has both the original Little Women, and it has, well, actually I can't remember which one it was. One country, one region, had this book split to 2, which was Little Women and Good Wives, and I've read both of those because in my edition they're all tied together. So we follow the story of Joe and Beth and Meg and Amy? Joe and Beth and Meg and Amy, I've not even said them in the right age order, but they are from the same family. They're not a very high-class family, and this book really likes to show that and to explore the angle of being somewhat not as well off in society, but surrounded by the money and the aristocracy of the early mid or the early northeastern coast of the United States. It definitely has that feeling of we get by. We're not doing the best, and we do need to look out for each other every now and then, but we try our best to get by. We find ways to find joy in all of this. And I'm even using these personal pronouns because towards the end you really feel connected to these characters. It's not their problems that you experience. It feels like you're with them in the book. You feel like you're really closely connected to them. And that just works so well because of how realistic it is, how relatable some of the problems is, even if it's a book from the 1800s. The author just finds a way to make these people feel so real and so enjoyable to be around that the illusion is very strong. Now, it's not entertaining, I will admit. It's not particularly engrossing because quite often it is just reading about someone's day. But I enjoyed it all the while nonetheless. I would give it also a 4 out of 5. Book number 3 is in translation. This is Perfume, the Story of a Murderer by Patrick Suskind. It is translated from the German, and it is quite a recent novel, I believe. It was written in, I want to say the 80s. It was written in 1985 in original German, translated to English in 1986. It is set in the mid-1800s, and it is about a very unusual person who's born in strange circumstances, and he realizes, well, the people around him realize he has no smell. So all human beings have some kind of scent to them just by their biology and by their DNA and everything. And our protagonist has no smell, no scent. He smells like nothing. But he is born with this unusually powerful sense of smell. So powerful that he can identify individual people by their scents. He can identify everything that gives off an odor in the world. And it leads to this genuinely bizarre style description where the sense of smell is just so emphasized. The author just languishes on all these different smells and odors, and to me it's kind of gross because it's not, well, definitely not just about pleasant odors. It's the whole range of things that you can smell, and a lot of it is quite repulsive. In addition to this, we have an incredibly morally ambiguous narrator who, because of his tragic upbringing, because of his ability, he can't really relate to other human beings. He sees himself as set apart from other humans. He realizes that because of his strong sense of smell, he desires to make the perfect perfume, not really out of any reason other than to just test the limits of his power, you know? So he sets himself to becoming a villain. He works at various perfume places, and he realizes that the idolatry of trying to find the perfect perfume is going to lead him to a lot of different troubles. So we see the evolution of this character as he develops. We see him kill people for the sake of trying to find this perfect perfume, and we're led to some very grotesque places as well. This book, so I didn't know very much about it, but I did know it had a reputation because it's so unique and so weird that it's a bit of an alternative fave for like the dark gothic musicians and artists. I think you can see the DNA of this work in a lot of other works of art coming out in the 90s and 2000s even. It's just that particular style of feeling, the kind of creepy, gruesome, vaguely historical, vaguely fantastical, vaguely horror. You don't really know where it's about to go. It doesn't make you feel comfortable or pleasant, but it does give you this almost perverse insight into this extremely strange individual. I think it works. I think it works quite well, but for me personally, I'm not really a person who likes works like this, and for much of it, I felt like it was trying to get under my skin. It was trying to get on my nerves, and I don't really see what it was doing beyond that. I felt repulsed, but that repulsion didn't push me towards thinking about deeper or larger things. I think there were many angles of morality that could have been more interesting to explore here, which just didn't feel like they were, because it's established from the very beginning that this protagonist is not a normal human being, is not a relatable human being, and so it's not so much about interrogating who this is, it's instead more just about watching their antics. So I didn't love it, although I definitely can see the appeal. I personally, though, would give it a 3 out of 5. Book number 4 is Beach Read by Emily Henry. This is a book talk extraordinaire. This is my aquatic for October, so it's not really about the ocean at all. It's not really about the beach at all. I felt lied to. So it is a romance novel. I've heard it described as an enemies to lovers romance novel. is kind of that, I guess. We have two characters who wind up on a bay in, I want to say, Michigan. I actually do think it is Michigan. The author wrote it using their own experiences growing up around the lakes of Michigan. However, it's a fictionalized town. We have our protagonist, who is a romance writer and also a bit of a mess of a human being. She inherits this holiday house from her deceased father, who had a tryst all through her childhood, and she only realizes afterwards, but she's living there now. She's trying to write this romance novel. And right next door is this brooding literary fiction writer who is grumpy and cranky and has a big party once a year where he plays Everybody Hurts, by REM. And that's their meet cute, is she yells at him to turn his music down. And then over time, they develop a relationship, and they develop a kind of literary challenge. So the protagonist decides that she's going to write a literary novel. Her name's January, which is surprising to me, but she decides she's going to write literary, and she challenges the neighbor. His name's Augustus, but everyone calls him Gus, or Everett is his surname. Challenges Everett to write a pulpy, feel-good romance. And so they decide to invite each other into their writing processes. So January goes along to interview cult members with Everett to better understand the novel that he's writing, whereas Everett goes along with stereotypical lovey-dovey dates with January. And it's honestly like a Netflix Christmas movie. It's just a pulpy, nice time with characters who feel a bit larger than life. Each of them have gone through their own traumas, but it doesn't feel like a book that's interested in interrogating those traumas. It's just using those traumas as a way to push these two together to make like nice, cute, romantic moments. And it's what you make of it. If you like stories that don't take themselves too seriously, and if you are okay with trauma and other dramas being used for the sake of pushing plot together and that's about it, then it's fine. I personally didn't value it a huge lot. I think there's so many other interesting things that could have been done, but I don't want to be dismissive of romance or of novels like this, because I had to recognize that if you're writing a novel that is going to be as easy to read as this, that's going to be as feel-good as this, and it is quite literary adjacent, it does make the reader feel like a very bookish person as you read, that's not easy. Being able to pull readers along with a plot like this and to make two characters believably fall in love is a very difficult thing to do, and Emily Henry does it like it's completely effortless. So I don't want to dismiss it. It, again, is not really my cup of tea. I think that it's written well, but it does some things that are okay in the romance genre and not okay in the list of books that I enjoy. So I give this a 3 out of 5. Alright, book number 5. We're actually smashing through this month. This is I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. It's his first novel. I'm amazed. So Richard Matheson is a kind of bubbling under figure in American horror. So he is really the cause of the revival of the vampire genre in some ways. This novel got compared to Dracula because there's not really another vampire novel between this and Dracula. It's crazy to me. And he went on to go write various episodes of TV shows, Twilight Zone very famously. He also wrote Hell House, which is quite a well-regarded haunted house novel. I Am Legend is about vampires. It's also about a global pandemic. Many people say this is a zombie novel, and I would agree. It bears all the classic zombie apocalypse tropes. It has one man, one last survivor, holed up in his house with canned goods and everything, just trying to make a living. He is trying to get over the trauma of seeing his close family members taken over by the plague, and every night he's beset by hordes of vampires outside his house that he needs to fend against. It's a zombie text, it really is. But the thing that's so remarkable is that it predates nearly all of the various tropey genre works. I think this is written in the 1950s. I almost definitely want to say 1950s. It is, 1954. And thematically and trope-wise, it feels like it could have been written 10 years ago, right? It feels like it could have been the inspiration for The Last of Us, and it probably was. But it's old, and I think it's difficult to appreciate that now, because there is definitely one reading of this work where you go into it not really knowing the history or the context behind it and feeling that it's quite derivative. And it also, to me, links up with the pulp sensibilities of the 1950s, where by the time you finish your novel, the beginning of the novel doesn't really matter anymore. The intention is not to make one big cohesive text, but instead just to pull the audience along a various stream of plot twists and surprises, and the twists that happen towards the end. They're good twists. They might be a little predictable given how much the genre has not evolved over the last 70 years, but they're good twists. But they're not things that really connect to the very early parts of the novel. Instead, we just get event after event after event. We get conflict upon conflict. It's a good thriller. It's very bleak. It's surprising to me because it's right after World War II. It doesn't feel quite like post-World War II fiction. It feels instead like the bleakness of Cold War fiction, where nothing really matters, the narrator doesn't know what they want to live for, everything's grey, everything's washed out. It feels like it's gone through the various cycles of darker and edgier to get us to today, when it predates it by so much. It's genuinely very surprising, and you can see the influence of this work in things like Stephen King and modern American horror. I think the genres of horror and science fiction, specifically the zombie subgenres, owe so much to this work. And it holds up. I do think it holds up. There are, of course, lots of problems with it. It is a pulp novel written in the 1950s. You can imagine the attitude it has towards masculinity, towards gender, towards race, towards all of those things, right? But just in its base components, as a very elemental thriller, sci-fi horror text, it's good. It's pretty good. I would give it a 3 out of 5. Okay, and the last one for October, this is my published in 2023, The Fraud by Zadie Smith. I loved White Teeth. I really, really did. White Teeth to me was just a brilliantly funny, unpredictable, wild jazz solo of a novel. The writing style was just so electric, and the characters were so diverse, so easy to follow. The Fraud is different, and I haven't followed Zadie Smith very much since reading White Teeth. I was aware that there was a bit of a conflict surrounding her and the critic James Wood calling her work hysterical realism, and as a result she significantly changed her style from her original debut, which is surprising to me. But The Fraud is just very, very different. So Zadie Smith is, I think, part Jamaican and English, and this novel does explore that angle of history. It reminds us that although England was one of the first abolitionists, they still did benefit from the atrocities of slavery, especially in the Caribbean, and we follow a historical narrative about the Tichborne Case, which is a real historical case where a person of good rank went off into the Caribbean, came back looking completely different, and claiming to be that person of high rank. And so half of the courts were thinking, this is the real Tichborne, this is someone who's gone off to the Caribbean and come back and just changed themselves, whereas there was another charge against this person who said, actually no, they are a commoner who fled to the Caribbean and came back and now are trying to pass themselves off as a person of high status. And we follow Miss Touche, I keep having to look for the names, Miss Touche, who lives with an author named William Ainsworth. Together they experience this case, they look at how English society treats this case, and they recognize that this Tichborne case becomes a microcosm for English justice, for how we look at human beings and whether they're real or fake. And if they are fake, to what extent does it matter? Because lots of things are fake. Money is fake, aristocracy is fake, familial heritage is fake, and fiction, which everybody seems to love so much, is fake. And it means that it really peels back the veneers of, well, Victorian society and uses that as a mirror to our own society. It looks at how authors have various roles when they're writing fiction, whether they are going to be like Charles Dickens and be a moralist, or whether they're going to be like William Ainsworth, who was a real historical figure and a real author whose works are not particularly well known but does feature in this novel. If you're going to be like William Ainsworth and write more sentimental or sensorial things, which this novel even says aren't as good, but can capture the imagination of the public. This is a pretty tough non-narrative to follow, I'm not going to lie. It's difficult for me to read. It's broken up into these little vignettes, and because of that, and because of just how many name drops it does to English history, if you're not really interested in the historical period of the 1800s, and if you don't know the key leading figures, I didn't even know that many, but I could just barely hang on, having read Charles Dickens, having read various authors from that era, knowing who Wilkie Collins is. That was my bare knowledge, and I could just barely hold on. So I think if you're new to the historical period, this book does not hold your hand. It's not very easy to get into, and it jumps back and forth in time as well. It uses historical markers, and it goes back and forth into the lives of these characters. It's pretty difficult. It's quite challenging, and it doesn't have that contemporary energy that White Teeth had that made that book so easy to read. This book, if I wanted to take it seriously, I would stop after every few chapters and really assess and make a timeline for myself and try to figure out what's happened. I think having a dutiful read like this makes this a lot more rewarding and a lot more meaningful, because there are definitely, I can be honest, chapters where I don't really know where in the timeline they are or what significance they take. I do understand the broad strokes of the narrative, and I did enjoy my time with it, but there is a lot more complexity there that I would like to interrogate further. So Zadie Smith is not really a historical fiction writer. This is her first historical fiction novel. It's surprising, it's unexpected. I learned quite a great deal, and the bit set in Jamaica following Andrew Bogle, who came along to England with the Mr. Tichborne, that's really fascinating, because that's a narrative about the slave experience in Jamaica and how that relates to the individual story of Andrew Bogle, but also what the role of the migrant is in 1800s England. It's such a fascinating foray into society and culture. I think the history of this novel is just really, really amazing. I just can't access it very easily, but there's definitely a lot here. And for someone who's interested in this time period, especially if they are a historian who is more interested in the Western side of things, I think a novel like The Fraud is very necessary, very important, and it does a lot for our understanding of race in 2023, looking back at how people were regarded in the 1800s. So I would give this a 4 out of 5. That's 6 books of October. I didn't get around to reading my 7th, so instead what I decided to do is I will start David Copperfield, and I will try to finish it in November. The original plan was to get halfway through David Copperfield, and I have gotten 4 chapters through, so I don't know how this is going to go. I'm going to try my best, but I have heard from many people that this book is quite boring, and look, I don't hate it so far, but it is starting with the narrator's birth, and after a couple of chapters in, we've not left childhood. We're going to follow the whole life. It's going to be boyhood, the novel, so I don't know how I feel about this. Hopefully there are enjoyable moments, but it's going to be difficult. I did not forget about A Suitable Boy. However, this is how far I got into it. Not very far at all. I got about 400 pages into this 1,400-page book. I'm going to come back to it. I actually didn't hate it. I quite enjoyed the various angles. I was surprised at how few characters there are for how big of a book this is. A lot of the names started getting quite familiar to me, and the core narrative of Lata and her family trying to find her a husband, that's interesting. I think that explores culture and individuality really well. There are other side stories about the economics of India at the time. There's a whole chapter devoted to making a pair of shoes. That is not as interesting, but you can really see the Dickensian ethos in a book like this. It is very much trying to bring that whole Victorian doorstopper style of writing into the modern context, but also looking at a historical period that's not Victorian England. It's good. I quite like it. It's just big and long and inefficient, but I will finish it one day. Alright, and that's my 6 books of October. Thank you again for joining. I'm almost about to hit 100 books this month, so that's going to happen next month. I'm going to be very excited to reach that milestone. I've never done anything like that in my entire life. But thank you for joining again. Thank you for looking at all these books. Hopefully you found something that you'd be interested in reading, and I will see you next time.